Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers, to this week's episode of Modern Leadership. I hope that you have had a great week so far and are ready to deep dive into another current topic in leadership. So let me ask, do you know the difference between networks and networking? The difference is huge, according to this week's guest expert, Jamie Millar. He says networking is often desperate and transactional, whereas networks are groups of peers we trust. James is the founder of SkyBridge Associates and the former director of MBA Admissions at Harvard Business School. He spent his career creating networks or peer groups for C-suite executives and board directors, essentially hand-selecting discussion groups for those who don't have many peers internally or may not realize how to benefit from them. He's the author of the brand new book, Building Bridges, The Case for Executive Peer Networks, which details why these relationships are important and how to create them. And today, he joins us to talk about this important topic. Jamie, it's great to have you on the podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jake. It's great to be here. I appreciate it.
Well, it was fun to kind of catch up with you before we hit record and talk about, what it's like out in the Boston area. And we talked a little baseball. And of course, we're getting right up on October, which is a big baseball month. Let me ask you, aside from the business intro that I just gave you, what did we miss by way of personal interests?
One of the things you missed is my interest in music, and I've heard some of your other podcasts. I know that you're a fan of Tom Petty and others. I'm a big music guy as well. I've played in a lot of bands, and it's a big passion of mine. And interestingly, for anyone who listens to the audiobook of Building Bridges, you'll hear music there, which I wrote and recorded as well. So I've managed to include my own music in my audiobook. So that's kind of my side passion as well.
Well, and I want to ask you about side passions. And by the way, that's really cool, that you compose basically your own music for your audiobook. I would love to do something similar, but while I'm a fan of music, I'm not quite the expert at doing it. But let me ask you, when it comes to side projects, I know you're a busy guy. I know you got a lot going on. How do you find time to get it all in?
I think it's like anything. I think it's about priorities. And I've never been one to buy this notion that you don't have time. I think, we all have exactly the same amount of time. If you look at Richard Branson has as much time as you or I have, and look at all the stuff he's accomplished. Steve Jobs had as much time as we have. And so I don't buy this idea that, people don't have enough time to do the things that are really important in life. I think it's about choosing. I think it's about prioritizing, and I've tried to construct my life in such a way that, I spend it doing what I love doing and what I'm good at doing, and where I think I can have some fun and add a little value at the same time.
Well, and I think that's a huge value of this podcast right now. We all have 168 hours in a week, and nobody has any time off. It's all filled up. Now, you may fill your time watching TV, or you may fill it, driving around the neighborhood or hitting a white ball across the golf course, but we all have the same amount of time. And anytime we add something to our schedule, we have to take something away. And so that's a great point there. Now, Jamie, I love this topic, this book that you just wrote and just came out about building networks. And we teased a little bit in the intro. There's a big difference between networking and networks. Let's dive into that a little bit.
For sure. And I think this is one of the most common misperceptions that people have about what I do. When I tell people what I do, they often say, oh, so you create networking events. And I say, no. Networking is a verb. And quite honestly, it's a verb that makes people feel dirty a lot of the time. Very few people enjoy networking. It's generally very transactional. It tends to feel superficial. It's just not something that makes us feel good. There's actually been academic research that has shown that people, don't like the idea of networking. That's very different from network, which is a noun. And I think if you look at the value of a network, we would all agree that having a good network has benefits. And for me, one of the big benefits of a peer network in particular, which is a kind of a subset of your broader professional network. But if you look at people who are peers of yours, people who kind of walk in your shoes, who empathize with the kinds of things that you're dealing with, it becomes a community. What I've found is that these groups, when we get them together and we meet on an ongoing basis, become a community. There's something deeper than just sort of transactional. Could you give me a lead? Can you do something for me? It becomes something much more visceral. It sort of feeds the mind and the soul at the same time. And so I think it's that is the mistake that people make. They tend to confuse the two. I absolutely believe in the power of networks. I'm very skeptical of most quote-unquote networking activities, though.
Yeah, and my experience has been that a lot of networking activities tend to be geared towards and populated by, kind of the up-and-comers in the business. If you're new to business or new to the industry, you want to go and be seen and introduce yourself around. And networking events, specific events designed for networking tend to be a great place to do that. However, one of the things that you point out, and one of the reasons that you wrote this book is, a lot of our C-suite level, our C executives are not dropping by networking events. You're not going to see Steve Jobs or, Richard Branson or any of these top executives just showing up at a cocktail hour or a mixer. And so you write this book and you spent basically your career developing these networks. And I want to hear a little bit more about this because this is so fascinating to me.
Sure. So you're right. It's a principle that I don't think enough people really understand. And let me just, if I could tell you a story, I described this in the beginning of the book, but this is a real story. And it's an epiphany I had about 3 years ago where I was standing on a top floor, a 50th floor of a New York, Midtown Manhattan office tower, looking out over the city. And all of a sudden, it became clear to me that in every building, and those of you who've been to New York will know that there are hundreds of buildings when you look out the window. It's just a sea of buildings. And in every one of them, I knew that there were at least a dozen people who needed a peer network, senior executives, sort of VP level and above, or SVP level and above, who needed a peer network and didn't have it, who really would benefit from that. And so I have been on, really kind of a campaign to make people aware of this. We talk about Steve Jobs. I feel a bit like Steve Jobs the day before the iPhone was launched, when nobody knew that we needed an iPhone. He knew we needed an iPhone. Nobody else knew it. And as soon as it was launched, everybody realized, my gosh, I've been missing an iPhone all this time. And I think that's where we are with executive networks. I think people, because they have this false idea about networking and this sort of negative bias against networking, they fail to realize that what they actually need is a strong peer network. And I think that part of what I'm trying to do through the book and podcasts like this is to just make people aware that this is a professional resource that you probably don't have and that you would almost certainly benefit from.
And do you feel at this point, Jamie, that this is somewhat of an uphill battle? You hear a lot of business experts and gurus, strategy experts that basically say when creating a product or service, you're fighting an uphill battle when you're trying to introduce something that people don't know yet that they want. Now, once you reach that tipping point, like the iPhone did, all of a sudden everybody jumps on board. But that first initial grind, to get up to the tipping point can be tough. Do you feel like, your efforts have been somewhat of a grind, an uphill climb, or has it been well accepted?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes, it's been well accepted. It is an experiential buy though for people, for people to spend their time and in some cases their money, they have to. It's they're people are Missouri, show me, because again, I think a lot of people do have this built-in bias, this misperception. So I wouldn't say it's been an uphill battle. When I describe what it is, I think people immediately recognize that it would be valuable and it's very different from what they expected. But you're right. I think when people hear the term network, they immediately think of networking, and so that does make it more of a stretch. Which again is why I wrote the book. It was a way to get people to realize that this isn't what you think it is, and this is actually something that you need.
As I brought up that topic and asked that question, I used the word tipping point, which immediately directed my mind to the book, Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell. And one of the things he talks about in there is the early adopters. And I think that what you're doing by writing the book and by doing the podcast tour and really getting out there in the community is to really help find those early adopters and help bring them in. And so what I want to talk to you about is, you wrote this book, you had a purpose, you had a desire behind it. You also had an outcome and a goal. And there's 5 principles that basically establish the foundation of why you felt that we needed this book. And I want to walk you through each of them and talk about them in turn. The first principle is this: leadership is more art than science. And it's getting more difficult all the time. Now, this is the Modern Leadership Podcast. We try to talk about leadership exclusively on this show. So tell us about this leadership being more art than science and why it's getting more difficult.
Sure. So to answer that question, I think we have to go back to the distinction between complicated problems and complex problems. And I don't know if you've spent much time on the podcast exploring that. It's actually a fascinating topic. But the big difference between complex and complicated is that complicated problems are the domain of experts, right? If you want to put a man on the moon, we can figure out the calculations, and with a pretty high degree of likelihood, we can land a spacecraft on the moon. So that's a complicated problem. Complex problems are ones where we don't really understand the relationship between inputs and outputs, right? So and by the way, almost every problem involving human beings is a complicated problem. It's impossible to predict how a single human being will react, much less a group of human beings. And so you have to approach complicated and complex problems very differently. And honestly, the only way to really address a complex problem is through experimentation. You see how the system responds to various inputs. But part of the reason I talk about leadership being more art than science is that, again, if it was purely science, we would have an equation, right? For almost any leadership problem, there'd be a very simple equation: do X and Y will result. But that's not how the world works, as we know. It is complex, and we don't understand necessarily how the inputs and the outputs are connected. And my point is that that level of complexity is getting more and more acute as we have a more and more global environment, as we have more and more technology, as life moves faster and faster, the nature of the complexity increases. So that's really what is behind that point.
And this is a fascinating topic that we need to cover more on the show. But I want to have you dispel the myth here that art is something that you have, like a talent that you're kind of born with, and science is something that you learn. And have you, kind of dispel this myth that if I wasn't born maybe with the natural leadership inclinations or leadership qualities, can I develop them? Can I build them into my life?
Oh my gosh, I think there's no question. I think art to me is about it's about creativity, it's about flexibility, it's about problem solving. It has nothing to do with what you're born with. I think it has everything to do with a willingness to experiment, a willingness to be open-minded, to pay attention to what you're experiencing, and then to act accordingly. So I think it's actually a very intuitive human skill. I actually think, frankly, more people can do art than can do science. Science takes a very specific linear mindset. I think we could all do art. I've never met a child who didn't like finger painting. We all do art. It's just inherent in us.
Yeah, and we're talking to an artist, right, Jamie? I mean, you talk about writing your own music and you're putting it on your audiobook, and this is something that was born out of years of practice and development. It wasn't something that you were necessarily born with, much like leadership. The second principle of building bridges is this belief that this idea that beliefs drive our behaviors and behaviors drive outcomes. And so the real starting point is belief. And so talk to us a little bit about the starting point, beliefs.
Right. And I think this is in many ways the foundation of a lot of the work I do. And a lot of the reason that leaders get together, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, is to really help make their beliefs known. We all carry with us beliefs that were some of which we're conscious of, many of which are unconscious to us, and yet those unconscious beliefs in every moment influence how we behave. And so this notion that our beliefs driving our behaviors, I think, is one we could all relate to, and the fact that then, of course, our behaviors are going to influence the outcomes. And so my point is that if you're not happy with the outcome in any part of your life, if you're not happy with your job, or you're not happy with your relationships, if you're not happy with your level of physical fitness, whatever it might be, whatever you're not happy with, whatever outcome you're not happy with, it's not enough to just act differently. You actually have to think differently. And knowing what you think in the first place is the first step. We can't start to think differently until we know what we think. So that really is in many ways one of the benefits of getting together with other people is it forces you to challenge what you actually think, because not everyone thinks the same, and it's sometimes help. We often assume that there's only one way to think about an issue, but we realize very quickly that there are many ways to think about it, and just challenging ourselves, I think, to think differently or to understand others' thought process is very helpful.
And I think you're absolutely spot on with this, Jamie. I'm a big believer in mindset. In fact, a lot of the coaching that I do on a day-to-day basis has its foundation in mindset and personal development. In fact, I believe that personal development precedes professional development. And so when it comes to looking at your outcomes, you need to change your beliefs in order to change your outcomes. And I think this leads to principle number 3. If your beliefs drive behavior and behavior drives outcome, how are leaders best able to refine those beliefs? Well, what you talk about and what this whole book is based on is through their trusted peer groups or peer networks and conversations. So talk to us a little bit about refining beliefs.
Right. And so, again, like I said, I think a big part of it is having a forum where on an ongoing basis you can really become authentic with each other. And I think again, getting back to our conversation earlier about networking, one of the biggest frustrations with networking events is that people feel inauthentic. They don't feel they can really be themselves and say what they actually think. They're putting on an act. And I think the beauty of having a group of peers that you meet with on a regular basis is that over time, trust builds and people's barriers fall. And I think that when your barriers fall, you're able to then start to really explore what you believe. So again, it could be a belief about yourself. It could be a belief about your job, about your organization, about your industry, about your place in the world. There's any number of beliefs that we all carry with us. But again, I think that's the beauty of having a group of peers who again, are walking in similar shoes to yours. It's not that there isn't value in, if you were to walk into your local 7-Eleven and talk to the kid behind the counter, that person has beliefs as well, but they may not be as useful to you in helping you really challenge your own beliefs. In my experience, people I think find it easier to really kind of dig into their beliefs if they're interacting with someone, kind of a peer or someone who has comparable experiences.
So I want to pull on that thread just a little bit with you, because as we look at these peer groups, and I look at my peer groups, and I'm a big believer. Jim Rohn said, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Zig Ziglar talks about you become part of what you're around. And so I obviously want to spend my time, reaching up to people that are above me that can help lead the way to success in my life. But as I look at that peer group and that group of people, how do I really get into that group? I mean, we talk about networking being, more entry level, more new people to the scene. How do we break into this C-suite group? How do we convince them that we need to get together and share ideas? Or do we convince them?
Well, I think someone has to convince them, right? So I think, and this in many ways gets to the 4th point of the book, which is that these conversations we're describing, these peer group conversations, rarely happen, and in particular, once you rise in an organization, they happen less and less frequently. When you're at an earlier stage in your career, you might go to a conference, or there might be events, there might be opportunities to get together with peers on a more regular basis. What you find as you get to a certain level within any organization is that you may be invited to a conference. You may present at the conference. You're probably not going to stick around and talk to people. And so one of the challenges, Jake, to your point, is that there really aren't a lot of these forums that are in place. And again, that's part of why I wrote this little manifesto in Building Bridges, which is to say, you have to insist on them. I think that as executives, we have to expect more. I think we've been settling for far too long without these forums. And there are a couple of ways that they can exist. Either you can 3 ways really. There are some good groups that exist already. So part of it is just finding them, asking your friends, asking people that you respect if they know of any groups that already exist. So that's one. The second way is through your professional services firms. We all work with accounting firms and law firms and consulting firms and other advisors. What I find is that in many cases, the groups that I run are sponsored by those third parties. It's a great way for them both to get firsthand insight. They sit almost as a fly on the wall as their biggest clients are talking to each other. But it's also tangible evidence that they give a damn, which is very hard. In a transactional world, it's hard to show your clients that you that you have their best interest at heart, that you're giving them something with no expectation of receiving anything in return. And so, if there isn't already a group, talk to your law firms, talk to your accounting firms and say, would you create something like this for people like me, for your client base, your prospective clients? And then the third is, if that isn't practical for whatever reason, the third is to create your own. And there are plenty of people who will take it upon themselves and say, look, I am going to, I'm going to find a group of peers in my local area, and we're going to get together on a regular basis. It takes more time. It's more work. We're actually just starting, not to plug our services, but we're actually just starting to support those. Not to just kind of work with champions,
kind of to facilitate them.
To kind of facilitate them and to drive them, again, kind of take the natural energy that's in a group, but people just don't have time or expertise to do it themselves, to schedule the meetings and to facilitate the meetings and so forth. So, part of what we're starting to do is to support that natural energy. I've talked to a few people that say, look, I run my own group, but we haven't met in a year because it's just too hard to find the time to kind of get it together and to keep the momentum up. There is some, there's a cadence and a momentum that you kind of look for. And so we can help with that. And there are others that can help with that as well. But so those are the three options. You really, find something that exists, encourage your professional services firms to create something, or create your own. But I think the do nothing option is not a great option. It has been people's default option to date, but I don't think it's the right option going forward.
Well, and what got you here is not going to get you there. So, I mean, you are where you're at. If you don't make a change and do something different, and I think we've walked through 4 principles so far that are screaming to us that one of the differences we've got to make is having these conversations, these peer networks. The 5th one then is, even though there are groups that are getting together, there's conversations happening, there's peer networks happening, they don't rise to the level of trust or accountability that's necessary. And I wondered if this had anything to do with the difference between what you're talking about and, say, a mastermind group. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Sure. And look, I have not had firsthand experience in mastermind groups. My sense is they're pretty good. Those who do them, I think, like them. In my experience, there's a couple of problems. One problem is that they don't happen often enough. There are lots of groups that will meet once a year, or maybe they're just one-off events, right? And I think that, as I said, the continuity really is a core design principle. This has to be something that people belong to. They can't think of it as an event they're going to attend. They have to think of it as a group that they belong to. And so I think that design principle is the first one. It has to be invitation only. So it can't be a group where you kind of throw out 100 invitations and see who shows up. That is not. You don't want people looking around and saying, "Well, gee, I was the chump who showed up. I'm the most senior person in the room." You want everybody to look around the room and feel like they were lucky to get invited, that they kind of just barely snuck in. And the ideal group, everybody feels that way. So I think having the right people around the table, having the right frequency, having the right agenda topics. There's a lot of effort that has to go into it. A lot of groups will try to get together and just shoot the bull for few hours, and that's fine once or twice. But at a certain point, people get busy, right? And so I think, in fact, I once took over a group that had met ad hoc that way for a number of meetings, and they found they just weren't getting any traction. And so, a large part of making these things work is again having the right agenda, having the right preparation, getting people to open up even before the meeting about what they really want to talk about, what their issues really are. It's sometimes very hard. We'll talk with everybody before every meeting, and oftentimes people will share things with us. They'll say, "Look, I don't really want you to bring this up in the meeting, but so let's get as an example. Someone might say, I'm really curious what other people are thinking about, bankruptcies. I work with some private equity investors, for instance, and they might say, I'm wondering if other firms are seeing an increase in bankruptcies. They don't want to bring it up in the meeting because everyone's going to say, well, hold on, are you guys having trouble at your portfolio companies? And yet they want to know the answer. And so, again, the beauty of having an independent party kind of driving the network and facilitating the meetings is that you can put things on the table that the members themselves might not. And also as as an outsider in a way, again, the people that I work with, these are the experts in their field. I'm not an expert in any of these things. But by being kind of an informed outsider that has built the trust with the individuals, you can ask the kind of quote unquote stupid question that's actually a perceptive question. And so I think part of the value, and when I say, this getting back to kind of, how do you make these things really work, really drive, is again having the right people, the right the right frequency and the right topics, and well run, by someone who doesn't have a vested interest in the outcome. That's always the problem when you get inevitably, if you have a vendor running this himself, if a law firm or an accounting firm tries to run their own, inevitably it becomes a sales pitch, and inevitably it becomes about them presenting to the group rather than creating an opportunity for the group to talk with each other. And so, it's all these elements that go together to really make these things work.
And I'm thinking as a society, we're becoming more open-minded. As a business society, we're becoming more accepting of outsiders coming in and running meetings or doing stuff for us. Historically, we were a do-it-yourself society. I mean, we mowed our own lawns, we cleaned our own pools, we did a lot of the handiwork in our houses on our own. But now we're becoming more of a society of either done for you or done with you. And I think that as you talk about getting these groups together and bringing in third parties to help facilitate it and help to really structure the agenda or the conversation so you can have the proper questions answered, and people don't have to feel put on the spot or feel, kind of pointed out or scheduled out. I think that this is going to gain more popularity as we go on in this done for you, done with you society. Now, let me ask you a couple quick questions. One is, what's a great group size for these peer networks?
So I always figure the best size is about 20 people. In my experience, we usually get about 2/3 that will make any given meeting. We typically meet 3 times a year for most of these groups. In my experience, you don't want more than about 14 people in the room. Once you get beyond about 14 or 15 around the table, people start talking at each other as opposed to with each other. And so, there's sort of an upper end. At a lower end, I think you could probably have 15, but you want sort of in that 15 to 20 range, and then you're going to get anywhere from 10 to 14 in the actual meeting.
And how often do you meet and for how long?
So again, it depends on the group. I usually advise 3 times a year. I think, particularly for groups that travel. Again, I facilitate a lot of groups where people come from far and wide. Again, as you get more and more senior and as the organizations are larger, you're going to find that your peers aren't in the same city. They just aren't. If you're a Fortune 500 company, you probably have 1 or 2 peers locally, but they're probably spread all over. So inevitably, people are going to have to travel. And so if you have a network where people are traveling to get to meetings, you're not going to be able to do it that often. And I find 3 times a year is a good cadence. If you only meet twice a year, the problem is that if somebody misses a meeting, they then go a year between meetings, and that's just too long.
And the dynamic changes, the relationship changes over that amount of time.
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. So, and we originally we were doing it quarterly, and then that just became too frequent because, you have summer and holiday season, sort of end of year. It's sort of hard to schedule meetings. So I think we have found over time that 3 times a year is a nice cadence. It's sort of often enough that people feel a sense of momentum, but it's not so often that they get fatigue from meeting too often. And then in terms of the length of the meetings, again, it depends. If people are traveling, you want them to feel that they've got enough out of it. At the same time, I work with very busy people who can't afford usually to take a full day. And so what we'll typically do is meet from 3 to 6 in the afternoon. It allows people to fly in that morning, do other work if they need to. We often will meet in major cities where they have other business they can do. Meet 3 to 6 and then take a break and then go have a nice dinner somewhere. So we have a nice mix of sort of some formal kind of facilitated roundtable discussion followed by a less formal dinner where people kind of really open up and talk more about their families and kind of get to know each other on a personal level.
And do you, as a third-party facilitator, do you kind of identify the topics and the agenda on your own and kind of present it to them, or do they come to you with questions and things that they're challenged with, and you design the agenda around that?
It's more the latter than the former. So as I mentioned, we talk with everybody in the group before every meeting. And these are open-ended conversations, kind of what are they struggling with? What are they, what opportunities do they have? Inevitably I'll have some topics that I want to test with people, things that others maybe have proposed or topics that came up in our last meeting that we want to dig into more deeply. And so really what I'm, for any given meeting, by the end of a round of calls, when I've talked with everybody, we probably talked about 15 or 20 different ideas, and some will have more support than others. And I think part of this gets back to the art of designing the agenda. Not everybody's going to love every agenda topic, but you create an agenda where everybody feels that they get some of their questions or some of their priorities addressed. And so it really is, the agendas really are driven by the members themselves. My job is to listen carefully, to hear patterns, and then to try to put together an agenda, not just for one meeting, but really over time that addresses a range of issues.
And do you bring in guest speakers, or is it more roundtable conversation discussion?
And again, that depends on the group. I would say that there are some groups I work with. So, for instance, I have some groups of general counsel. These are people, very senior in-house lawyers, and their view is, look, if there's a technical matter that I want education on, I can call my law firm, and I can call them at 9 a.m, and by noon I'll have one of the world's experts in my office. And so their view is, why would we spend our short time together having presentations? So they really, that group is entirely discussion focused. They really don't think it's a good use of their time to have third-party presentations. I have another group of board directors. There's a group up in Canada of board directors, and they very much enjoy having third parties, not to talk about governance or board matters, but to talk about issues that they see as sort of futuristic that they wouldn't deal with otherwise. So we've talked about blockchain, we've talked about artificial intelligence, we had someone come in to talk about kind of the changing geopolitical landscape. So these are things that just sort of help the directors to think a little bit differently and outside of what they would maybe hear in a regular board meeting. So again, the answer is it depends.
I love this conversation, Jamie, and I think I could pepper you with questions all afternoon long. I love this conversation, but alas, some of our listeners need to get into work. They need to do some work today, and we love the end of the podcast because that's where we add a little personal to go along with this business conversation. So I'd love to shift our direction and talk a little bit about a section we call Learning from Leaders. Does that sound okay with you?
That sounds great with me.
All right. So the first question in this section is, what is the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table? What are you reading?
Well, I'm reading a lot. If you were to see my bedside table, you'd be appalled. I've got a stack of books. I love reading fiction. I don't read nearly as much as I should. But one nonfiction book I've been reading, which is fantastic, is by Sherry Turkle, from MIT. Who wrote a book called Reclaiming Conversation. Again, you can tell I'm interested in this topic, but it's about the power of talk in a digital age. And she really gets into some of the ways in which the technologies that we so much enjoy also, make the kinds of conversations that I lead that much more rare. So that's one I've been enjoying.
Wonderful. How about your leadership superpower?
Oh gosh, I did the test on your website, and I think it revealed me as an inspirational leader, which I think I try to be. I also had someone, a good friend of mine, is a psychologist and does some work around kind of career branding, and he once helped me come up with a little tagline, which basically said, "I build deep connections through asking big questions," which I think in some ways is a superpower of mine. It's my curiosity, it's my openness, and my ability to build trust with people, I think has been a superpower.
And I think moving forward, Jamie, this is a superpower that's going to be much demanded in the world of business, and that is authentic relationships and deep relationships. I think the landscape is changing. I think it's becoming more personal and more where we need to deal one-on-one and less as a whole. And so I love that superpower. Of course, you're referring also as an inspirational leader to the superpower assessment that's on the website. It's free to take. And if any of the listeners want to take that, of course, it's jakeacarlson.com/superpower and find out what platform you lead from, whether it's inspiration or problem solving, whether it's accountability or adaptability or confidence. Next question for you, Jamie, is a motivational mantra, quote, or philosophy, something you live by.
So, and again, there are a whole bunch of those. So, at the risk of giving more than one, I hope that's okay. My kids will say that my philosophy is actually drawn from Star Wars. It's Yoda's famous line to Luke Skywalker that, do or do not, there is no try. The number of times I've said, when they say, "Oh, I'm trying," I'm like, "Well, do or do not, there is no try." So that's one that I sort of I would say have adopted. There's three. Kind of getting back to my love of music, there are three in particular that I want to highlight, which I think in a way help to inform my way of thinking. The first is Lindsey Buckingham from Fleetwood Mac, who once said, "If you're any good at all, you can be better." So it's that constant quest for self-improvement. Jerry Garcia, legendary singer for the Grateful Dead, said, don't be the best in the world at what you do. Be the only one in the world who does what you do, which I think just says it all. And then last but not least, I have to quote my favorite movie of all time, from Spinal Tap, where David St. Hubbins says, it's a fine line between stupid and clever. I think that often is the case too. So there you go.
These are three of the best quotes that we've had on the show, and they're unique. They're different from what we hear often. I love them. Thank you for sharing them. If you could imagine a 1981 lime green Mazda 626 with dancing bears going across the back of it, that was my high school drive.
There you go.
So I love that. A final question for you is the book that you most often gift to friends, family, or colleagues?
So there are, again, a couple. I had a hard time nailing it down to just one. I would say that The Fourth Industrial Revolution by Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum blew my mind. It is a fantastic book, and I really think it should be required reading of anyone in the business world. He just lays out a vision and kind of a clarity around what's going on in the world that really, we're going through some pretty remarkable times, and I think that book, for me, helped make it all very, very clear. And then the other, which is just fascinating for a different reason, is *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari. And those are both of those books are ones that I regularly recommend to people.
Well, and I thank you for sharing them with us. Both of them are going on to my bookshelf right now. You've got me interested in reading them. Jamie, I can't thank you enough for spending time with us. Before we let you go, how can we learn more about you? And of course, how can we help you sell some more books?
Well, my books are available in all the usual places, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's available in hardcover, paperback, ebook, and audiobook.
Well, and we want to do the audiobook, right? So we can hear your music.
You can hear the music. You can, and by the way, the one thing I should say is that this book was written with an executive in mind. The vision I had as I was writing it was of someone throwing it in their bag on the way to the airport and reading it cover to cover on the flight from Boston to New York. And so it's a 60-page book. It's a 45-minute read tops. The audio book is an hour, and by the way, the average commute in this country is about a half hour. So you could listen to it, on your round trip commute, typically in a single day. So, I really wanted to make this accessible. I didn't want this to be something that people were going to have to feel they had to plow through. Like I said, it's available in all the usual places. If you want to find out more about me or more about what we do here at SkyBridge Associates, it's just skybridge.associates. So www.skybridge.associates is the website.
Well, wonderful, Jamie. We're going to link all of that up on the show notes. And I got to tell you, I'm not going to tell you one of my favorite books, the title of it, but I will say it's only 30 pages. And my favorite thing about it is I am so much more grateful that they wrote it in 30 pages and sold it to me for $18 than wrote it for 300 pages and sold it for $18, because those extra 270 pages would have been worthless. I love that you've just focused on what you want to say and done it. Jamie, thank you for being this week's guest expert. It's been sure a pleasure to have you on the Modern Leadership Podcast.
Well, thank you, Jake. It's been a pleasure. You've asked some great questions, and I really look forward to talking with more of your audience about this.
All right, my friends, what did you think about that? It was so great to have Jamie on the show today. I think he's been one of our most articulate guests. He really knows his stuff. And I was fascinated by this whole concept of a peer network and really using network as a noun and creating something that will help me reach the next level in my career development, my professional development, everything that I'm doing. And I think there's a lot of actionable advice, but I think we didn't get to a whole lot. I think we need to get some more. And so I'm going to pick up a copy of his book, and I hope that you will as well. Of course, everything that we talked about will be on the show notes for this episode, which is episode 86. And the show notes are at jakeacarlson.com/ML86, which is where you will be able to find all the links to the quotes, the discussion topic, and of course, those books that we mentioned. Until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. Go out and build your network. And of course, stay awesome. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.